But when we're talking about Mormonism, this is a personal subject for you. Why is that?
Well, okay, so this was exactly I was raised in a family mostly of unbelievers, right? There were no Christians growing up, and my dad is not a Christian. He's not a believer, but his second wife, when he married her, pretty quickly after they got married, I was about 5 or 6, she became a Mormon. And they ended up having 6 kids together. So I have 6 half siblings, 3 boys, 3 girls, all of whom were raised within the LDS faith. And I was not a believer until I was about 35. And I remember when I was about 35 and was looking at the scripture for the first time and looking at it from an investigative template, which I've always talked about, my sister was in college. And she saw that I was getting interested in scripture. So she right away, I don't know if she did this on purpose, but I had Mormon missionaries at my door. And I think she was interested. Hey, if you're interested in God, well, now you can join us. And to be honest, if Mormonism was true, it would have been the perfect marriage for me because I had a bunch of siblings who were already in the faith. So I looked at the Book of Mormon, Doctrines and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price. Those are the scriptures that Mormons use. As I was examining the Christian scriptures for the very first time. As a matter of fact, I read through the Book of Mormon before I even finished the Old Testament. So I was really interested to see, and I simply applied the same test that I applied toward the Christian scriptures. I simply applied those to the Book of Mormon. And I always say that if you take an investigative template, it'll not only lead you to what's true, but it'll keep you from falling into what's false. And so that's what my story was. Hey, I always tell people I became a Christian at the same time that I became a not Mormon, because those two processes were happening simultaneously for me. And as I was examining the scriptures of both systems to see, do they hold up as eyewitness accounts?
What would be some of those examples of those eyewitnesses that you saw didn't align?
Well, eyewitnesses have 4 attributes. We test eyewitnesses in court under 4 criteria. Number 1, were they really there to see what they said they saw? So I need to know from a scripture perspective, is the scripture early enough to have actually been written by eyewitnesses? 2, can they be corroborated in some way, even though I know that no witnesses get, like, I work cold cases. Those are before video. So I don't typically have a video that repeats every claim of an eyewitness, but I should see some corroboration. 3, do they change their story over time? And 4, is there any reason, any motive for the person to lie to me? And there's only 3 reasons why anyone lies. So I can investigate that template. I simply applied that to the author of the Mormon scriptures, who's Joseph Smith. So I think as I applied that, I realized really quickly, this is not going to hold up. It doesn't hold up. I mean, it's demonstrably false, to be honest with you. It's demonstrably false. And I think part of the problem is that even as Christians, this is, not many of us take a kind of evidential approach to our Christian beliefs, let alone an evidential approach to Mormon beliefs. So it's really hard for us to kind of sort out and know why. And look, if nothing else, you may not convince the Mormon missionary at your door, but if you know what's true evidentially, the Mormon missionary won't convince your kids. And that to me is worth the price of admission right there.
Yeah. And we're going to discuss that because I was kind of caught off guard, I think, just in the moment of rushing in the door with my kids. And I wish I'd set a better example to my children. But for those listening, give us a brief history of Mormonism, like Mormonism 101.
Yeah, so basically Mormonism starts with Joseph Smith, a young man who was born around 1805, and he's born during the kind of second great awakening in the United States in the Northeast. He's in a place called Palmyra, New York, and he's there as this kind of wave of evangelists, Charles Finney, others who are very charismatic, are coming through the Northeast and proclaiming the gospel. And he also is somebody who's, it's an interesting, I've written about this online, so just pardon me as I kind of occasionally refer to those writings because I think they're helpful. And I just kind of traced my own investigative journey through this. But he claims he's born in 1805. So this second great awakening is going to occur from about 1790 to about 1850-ish. So he's right in the middle of it. And lots of people are coming to faith. And the sad part of it is, and this is why I think what you guys do, what Billy Graham Association does, and have always done, is partner with local churches to make sure that those people who get saved are placed in local churches so they can grow in orthodoxy. This was not happening in the Northeast in this second great awakening. So people were coming to faith. And it turns out a bunch of sect groups like Seventh-day Adventists, Mormons, all kinds of sect groups emerge at that time in that region because no one's being discipled. They're getting saved in these large events, but not getting plugged into local churches, which goes to illustrate why it's so important that when we do events, we are connected to local churches. Anyway, long story short, he makes a claim that around 1820, he's visited by God the Father and Jesus, and that a couple of years later, he's visited by an angel named Moroni who says that there is a set of tablets buried in the ground on the hill Cumorah that describe a history of ancient Jews from about 600 BC to about 430-ish AD who come over to the Americas from Israel by way of boat and basically start a culture here on the North American continent, and ultimately then are visited by the risen Christ. After he ascends on the in the area of Jerusalem, he visits these people who are here, a lost tribe of Jews on the North American continent. This is a bold claim. And the Book of Mormon has a 1,000-year history of people groups, monetary systems, wars, cities, leaders, animals, agricultural products that allegedly occur on the North American continent in that 1,000-year period. And so this is the claim of the Book of Mormon. Now, if you look at the claim itself, and by the way, and it changes over time because Joseph changes over time. But that's the initial claims of the book written called the Book of Mormon. Now, it's allegedly transcribed from these golden plates, not because he has the ability. And as a matter of fact, when he does this, he's not even necessarily looking at the plates as he's translating. He often is looking, he's a seer. He's looking in a stone, in a hat, in which he's getting the vision of what the words are word for word. It's a very interesting process. But the point is, he allegedly takes all those words written on the golden plates and makes them into the Book of Mormon. And then those golden plates are eventually taken back. So we don't have any evidence of the golden plates. But this is the claim. And so the Book of Mormon is allegedly this translation and transcription of the golden plates that he discovers around probably, depending on how you date his story, in 1823-ish, by 1827 or so, you have these plates. So that's the in a nutshell, the kind of claims of at least how the initial scripture, the Book of Mormon, was received by Joseph Smith in the early 19th century.
And what I know you often look at what the motive is for Joseph Smith. What would have been his motive, the reasons of motive?
Well, look, just because you have a motive to do bad things does not mean you're going to necessarily do a bad thing. There's lots of people who have motive, just don't act on it. But when people do act to lie or to do anything nefarious, they only do it for one of three reasons. These are the only three motives for any misbehavior: financial greed, sexual or relational lust, and the pursuit of power. That those three are the three. And they're in scripture, but I realized those working criminal cases. It was always in those categories. So it's pretty easy to look for your suspect. Now, you have to ask yourself, for example, when I was examining the Gospels, I'm asking myself, okay, so what did the apostles gain in money, sex, or power? Like, what are they getting out of this? And if there's nothing to gain and instead just the opposite occurs, then you at least have eliminated the motive for the lie. The problem with Joseph is that he gained from all three of those. Eventually, he makes a claim in Scripture and Doctrines and Covenants that polygamy has been ordained by God. Now, he was involved in a polygamous relationship years before he writes this scripture, but he ultimately had anywhere from 27 to 30 plus wives, many of whom were very young, many of whom were already married to somebody else, all of whom were consummated sexually. So is there a sexual motive? Yes. There is. He's written in the scripture that he's to be supported by the church. And from a power perspective, he at one time actually led or at least was in control of probably the second largest standing army on the North American continent. So there's a power, even ran for president at one point. So there is a power, sex, and money motive. But this alone does not mean that Joseph is lying. It just means that he would have good motivation to lie.
What are some important differences in Christianity and Mormonism, especially maybe when it comes to grace? For those who are listening, what are some of those important differences?
Yeah, I want to get to that because that's a huge difference. But here's the bigger difference. If you said, I want you to go and talk to Jim Wallace, and he lives in this city, it's really important. And you said, well, yeah, but there's a lot of Jim Wallaces there. Well, you said, well, I'm talking about Jim Wallace, who's a police officer. There's other Jim Wallaces that are police. Well, no, I'm talking to a Jim Wallace that was a police officer in the city of Torrance in Los Angeles County. Well, there's actually three of us, my son, my dad, and me. We all have the same name, all work. So it turns out that you need more. You can use my name, even my description roughly, a police officer at this agency, yet still not get me. Because it turns out the identity of Jim Wallace matters. And if you said, for example, hey, I need you to talk to Jim Wallace because you have this cancer, well, he knows the cure for that cancer. But you got to get the right Jim Wallace. It turns out that my identity really now matters because it's a life and death situation. This is what's happening with the Jesus that is preached by Mormonism. Yes, he's got the name Jesus, but if his identity is not the identity of the Jesus of Scripture, for example, the Quran describes Jesus. Yet we would not say that that description of Jesus in the Quran is an accurate description. We wouldn't trust that Jesus, who was a prophet greater than Muhammad, but did not die on the cross and rise from the grave. That's a different Jesus. And so we would not say that that's the Jesus of Christianity. Well, something very similar is happening here. And the difference is that we believe that Jesus does everything that we need to be saved. We can do nothing. That is grace. It's a free gift. You cannot add to it. The equation basically is faith plus salvation equals works. Under Mormonism, it's different. It's faith plus works equals salvation. Now, I'm going to say this, but I'm going to tell you that if you were to talk to most of your friends or people you know in the social media sphere who are Mormons, they may not agree with that description. I'm telling you what Mormonism teaches, not what a Mormon you might meet today would say it teaches. And this is going to be frustrating for a lot of people because it turns out most Mormons do not know what Mormonism teaches.
The same can be for Christianity.
Yes.
So look what somebody says. This is applies to us why we need to know our scripture, what we believe, why we believe it, because most Christians still wouldn't even know what they believe. It's the same thing.
Same thing. So if you'll say, well, yeah, but Mormonism teaches X, a lot of your Mormon friends will say, no, it doesn't. Well, actually, I don't know that it does. And I think at some point, if you were to say, well, here's what Joseph taught about certain theological principles, they would say, well, we don't believe any of that. They don't believe that polygamy is ordained by God. They don't believe in a plurality of gods. Joseph started to believe all these things and wrote about these in Scripture. So I always say, well, if you're going to abandon the Jesus described by Joseph, how about just abandoning Joseph? Like, you don't need Joseph to know Jesus. So grace, for example, is one of these key areas. And here's how I typically describe it to students when I'm training them in this area. Grace under Christianity is that Jesus, as a free gift, provides you with salvation you cannot earn on your own. Grace under Mormonism is the power that God gives you to obey the law. Here's what I mean. If you talk to your Mormon friends, they said, okay, I'm on planet Earth and God is in heaven. How do I get to God in heaven? They'll say, well, it's only through Jesus. Okay, well, we agree with that, but drill down on this. By the way, the word heaven is negotiable. When we say heaven, we're thinking about being in the presence of Jesus the minute we close our eyes. They're thinking about the three levels of heaven: celestial, terrestrial, and celestial kingdom. So you have to be very specific. I always say, how do you get the highest level of eternity that God offers you? Now, that's celestial kingdom under their system, because everyone's going to be in celestial kingdom. It's celestial kingdom is the highest. For us, it's just called heaven. So you have to be very clear when you say heaven, you're talking about celestial kingdom. How do you get there? Well, here's what they would say. Under Mormonism, you're on earth. God is in celestial kingdom. If you want to be there with him, Jesus comes to you. So it's true. Without Jesus, you can't get there. And he gives you a ladder. Your job is to climb the ladder. So you could rightly say that except for the grace of Jesus, you could never be with the Father because he's the one who comes to give you the ladder. But it turns out you have to climb the ladder in your own good works. Under Christianity, Jesus doesn't give you a ladder. He drops down on a rope, and while you're kicking and screaming, he pulls you up anyway. That is the grace that's offered under Christianity. There's nothing you can do. As a matter of fact, on your own, you're a rebellious mess. Grace is very different under these two systems. And that difference is absolutely critical. I'll give you why. If you're a ladder climber, I guarantee you're going to start looking at other ladder climbers. And you're going to go, you know what? I'm climbing this ladder better than they are. And this is why you'll see sometimes Mormon influencers who are they proclaim the virtues of their family, because I've seen it over and over again. There's this comparison between how well are you doing. Also, remember, under our system, you can know right now that you are saved. You see it in our scripture. Paul describes us as citizens today. We're not going to be citizens. You could be citizens if you work hard enough. No, you are citizens of heaven now. Under Mormonism, you never really know. You won't really know. And their leaders have said it, that you won't know for years, maybe, that you are truly saved, because it's not dependent on something that Jesus did. It's dependent on something you do over time. There is the difference. It's the security of knowing now that you are saved. But honestly, Sissy, if you were to talk about these theological differences between Mormons and Christians, I'm not sure how far you're going to get. So here's what I always tell people, because Mormons love personal testimony. And you know how I feel about personal testimony. I'm like, you got to have more than just personal testimony, because Mormons are so good at this. But I would always say, look, I did read the Book of Mormon, because that's what they want you to do. Read the Book of Mormon from cover to cover, and then ask God if it's true. That's it. Don't go any further than the Book of Mormon. So when I went further and I had the whole quad, there are 4 sets of scripture, Old and New Testament, Book of Mormon, Doctrines and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, and I read through all of it. I was fascinated by it. When I came to the Book of Abraham, now I have got demonstrable proof this is a lie. Because in the 1840s or so, when a salesman of antiquities came through Ohio, where Joseph was staying with his followers at the time, he sold Joseph a papyrus that Joseph translated into the Book of Mormon. The papyrus was eventually lost, so there's no way to know what was on that papyrus until it was recovered in New York State years later. And now we can see what is on that papyrus and if it matches Joseph's Book of Abraham. It doesn't. The word Abraham is not even present on the papyrus. The illustrations that Joseph puts in the Book of Abraham are still on the papyrus, but it's a book of breathings. It's an ancient Egyptian papyrus. It has nothing to do with what Joseph. And so now we have demonstrative proof that Joseph is not an accurate translator. So for me, I was at least willing to entertain until I got to the Book of Abraham. And then I realized, no, he's not telling the truth. So that's why I said, okay, now I'm done with this. But how many people do you know, Christian or Mormon, who have examined the history of their own claims? You know, remember, Joseph's not saying something, he's inventing something new. Joseph's claim was that he was restoring something lost. The claim was that the true essence of Christianity was lost at the death of the disciples. And if that's the case, Joseph's just coming to restore what was lost. Well, I'd already done work to see the transmission of the ideas of Jesus through the centuries, from the actual eyewitnesses who saw Jesus to their students, to their students, to their students. Tracing that chain of custody helped me to have confidence that nothing was lost. But most Christians don't do that heavy lifting, so they get sucked into the lie.